Welcome on the Me&my Health Up podcast show. Dr Rosalba Courtney, how are you doing today?
Hi there, Anthony. It's Rosalba. It's a hard one.
Yes.
It's tricky. Yeah, it's an Italian name, Rosalba.
Rosalba.
Spanish too. Yeah.
My wife's Italian, so there we go. It's I've now got a correct pronunciation, even though I was practicing the incorrect pronunciation before the episode so that I'd get it right. But anyway, Rosalba. So Dr. Rosalba, please share how you have arrived at what you're doing today as a functional breathing expert.
Okay, I'd be delighted. So my story is that long time ago, over 40 years ago, I started working as a naturopath, and I was an osteopath, and this is way back in the 1970s. And in those days, osteopaths and naturopaths were trained with one degree. It was like a 6-year course. And then we did, I also did acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine. So I became interested in breathing because I had a few patients who had strange and bizarre breathing problems. And I'd also run across some very interesting practitioners who were using breathing as, a tool for healing. So these patients who weren't responding well, I thought that I would look into their breathing. And it just sort of grew and grew, and I got more and more deeply into it. And in the 1990s, when I had my youngest child, I took some time off work and then got very involved in a breathing therapy called the Buteyko method. Then I went off to Russia, did some study with Dr. Buteyko, and became chairperson of the association and so on. And it was like back then, there was a lot of public interest in the Buteyko method. But for me, what started to happen was we saw great results, really fantastic results. But the more I learnt, the more questions I had. And I realized that there were some sort of gaps and things about Buteyko theory that didn't quite work, and that there was more to this story. So I actually stopped practicing and I stopped teaching, and I went to do a PhD in 2002. And that turned into an 8-year PhD, which was called Dysfunctional Breathing, Its Parameters, Measurement, and Clinical Relevance. So I took a really, really deep dive and ended up with this. Coming out of that, I came out with the therapy, which is integrative breathing therapy, which is a particular way of working with breathing in a way that's really like professional, evidence-based, comprehensive. And it's this sort of model that is about the 3 dimensions of breathing, which is the biomechanical, which is like the muscles and the breathing patterns, the biochemical, which is about oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH, and then about the psychology of breathing, the psychophysiological, about how the body perceives symptoms, really, and how the mind and emotions affect breathing and how breathing affects the mind and emotions. So it's this sort of complex, but really quite, in the end, practically quite simple way of working with breathing as a tool for healing.
It's such a interesting area of health because we come into the world, we take our, we come into the world with a first breath, and we leave the world with our last breath. And so breathing is something we need to do in order to stay alive.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're never really taught at any point, unless they do your course or, they start to, people get curious about, about breathing or these different methodologies around breathing. And so I was just wondering, why is it that we struggle to breathe? So is it something that, because you'd expect it to be innate or,
exactly. Everyone's a breathing expert because everybody breathes to stay alive. And also breathing is the most commonly used self-regulation tool. There's actually research showing that across cultures, breathing differently, more slowly, focusing on the breath, taking a deep breath, structuring a sigh is the most common way that people will self-regulate across all cultures. Like it's really there in the human experience. So in a way, everyone's an expert. But the thing is that breathing, because breathing is affected by everything. It's so fundamental to life that even sort of your experiences early in life, in that neonatal period, if breathing or the airway is threatened, that can change the neuroplasticity of breathing control. And then, a lot of people have some obstruction in their breathing or airway. As children, they might have enlarged adenoids and tonsils, or they might have some issues with their throat or upper airway or tongue, which slightly impair breathing. Or they might have illnesses, viral illnesses, chronic infection. They might have stress or trauma. And all of those things impact on breathing control. So our breathing control system is highly sophisticated, and breathing is very connected to really our whole history and also the functioning and health of all other body systems. So that's what I learned, when I was doing my PhD. And when I delved into the literature and really looked at the science of breathing, and I looked at the, traditions and the different ways people have worked with breathing, trying to bring it all together was just absolutely fascinating and intriguing. And I'm still completely, passionate about the whole subject. And so the thing is, once breathing becomes dysregulated, once breathing becomes dysfunctional, then people don't feel right about their breathing, and they're not often very good at breathing in the way that, makes them feel better or feel good or improve their health and wellness, because they get locked into certain vicious cycles. And that's what dysfunctional breathing is. And sometimes what looks like dysfunctional breathing was actually an adaptation to something that was happening in their life, like an obstructed airway or having a high level of stress and trauma and arousal because of increased, readiness for dealing with a crisis. And so they, need sort of help when that breathing is no longer helpful. And then what I try and do is evaluate people carefully. So I evaluate the chemistry of breathing. I evaluate breathing muscles. I evaluate how they're perceiving and feeling their breathing, and how stress and breathing are prominent, in their daily lives. And then I set about trying to create an individualized, assessment informed treatment of their breathing. So it's kind of beyond just simple breathing exercises. It's really about another realm, breathing as a healing tool.
Wow, there's so much to it. I didn't realize it was so complicated. I thought it was. No, it's just me. So
I'm trying to put it all in a nutshell in a short period of time.
Oh, you're doing really well. I was just thinking from a listener point of view, they're thinking, well, how do I know that what are the telltale signs and symptoms that someone's not breathing as they should or as optimally, or what are some of the telltale signs and symptoms?
Yeah, I think looking at the major things, so some major signs would be, looking at, say, regularity of breathing. So a healthy person doesn't have a rigid breathing pattern. They will have breathing that's responsive and variable. So there'll be some sighs in there, some yawns in there, and their breathing will change, in response to life. And that's called, structured or normal variability. And then there are people who have dysfunctional breathing where their breathing becomes highly irregular. So they have too many pauses, too many sighs, too many yawns. And some people just sigh and yawn nonstop. Okay, so that would be one sign. Another one would be breathing has lots of functions. So it has primary and secondary functions. And one of the secondary functions of breathing is to actually act as the conductor of the orchestra of the other oscillating systems. So heart rate variability, blood pressure, there are different oscillators within our body, and breathing should be able to coordinate those. So, for example, if you don't very effectively, and I don't know how the average person is going to measure this, but if you're if you breathe really slowly and it doesn't affect your heart rate variability in a positive way, that would be another sign. You know, you've disconnected oscillators. Another thing would be, if another function of breathing is self-regulation, being able to focus on your breath as people do in meditation, you know, mindfulness of the breath. And most of us, when we stop, focus on the breath, mindfully feel it, we feel calmer and it makes us feel good. People with really dysfunctional breathing, when they connect with their breathing, it's uncomfortable and unpleasant for them. And that's a big red flag for dysfunctional breathing. So, for example, there's been some research showing that, you know, while meditation traditions, many of them focus on the breath as the primary focus of attention, in modern society, about 40% of people do not choose breathing as their primary anchor for attention. It distresses them, perhaps. Not all of them, but, you know, they don't choose it as a primary anchor. And there'd be some of those people that it's because, you know, focusing on their breath makes them uncomfortable. So that would be another red flag. Another one is things like just feeling kind of unusually breathless with no explanation. So feeling breathless out of proportion to your level of fitness, or suddenly appearing to lose your fitness. I've worked with some elite athletes, and I've worked with, you know, people on sports scholarships and major universities in the US and whatever, you know, Ironman champions and so on, who all of a sudden, it's like they were really unfit. All of a sudden their heart rate is high and they're easily breathless, and that's because their breathing has become dysfunctional. There'd be some signs, things like, you know, if you've got a very rigid pattern where you're always breathing upwards, you know, in a vertical pattern, breathing with your shoulders and up into the upper chest. It's okay to breathe in all kinds of ways, because functional normal breathing should be adaptive. I say that functional adaptive breathing should have ears, right? E is an acronym for efficient, adaptive, appropriate, responsive, and supportive of other body systems, which maybe sounds like a lot, but it's got ears. So it's breathing with ears is variable because it's always adapting to situations, your internal or your external environment. And, you know, that's quite different to how, like, you know, breathing's become a bit popular. There's books and, you know, popular books and so on, and different breathing techniques that people hook into. And, you know, and everyone goes, well, what's the perfect way to breathe? You know, is it always nasal? Is it always diaphragmatic? Is it always into the lower rib cage and chest? And I go, yeah, well, mostly, it should mostly be those things. But people get kind of, they start to do things that aren't right for them because they're not getting the nuance about what a wonderfully responsive system the breathing system is, where it's a regulator of the body and multiple body systems, and it's also an indicator of homeostasis and of the function of multiple body systems.
Thanks for sharing. I was wondering also, how does someone tell if they're like a predominantly a mouth breather versus they're using the nose? Like, for example, I sort of come across this as a default in my own personal life because I kept slobbering on my pillow at night.
Right. That's a good way. Yeah.
But I didn't actually draw the connection until many years. I mean, we're talking 4 decades of doing this, right? So I was just wondering, is there some ways at which people could determine whether they're a mouth breather and may need some support in order to breathe nasal? Yeah.
I think just noticing, you know, if you're breathing in the day, and notice whether you start to mouth breathe with a challenge, like a little bit of exercise. If you go to the gym, most people, the minute they hit a treadmill, even if it's not very hard, the mouth opens, right? They've got no sort of capacity to keep the breathing through the nose when there's a little challenge, a hill, or, you know, a bit of extra exercise. So that's something to look at first. So, you know, Normally we would breathe about 5 liters of air in a minute, 1 minute. But we can actually breathe about 40 liters through our nose in a moment if we've got just an average nose. And many people are way below their capacity and they immediately will switch to mouth breathing. So keep an eye out for things like that. And in terms of breathing through your mouth at night, if you're snoring, that could be a sign that you're a mouth breather, because mouth breathers snore more, although you can also snore with your mouth closed, so it's not a definite indicator. And things like, do you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning? Do you wake up with a dry mouth? Slobber on the pillow is probably a good one too. And then you can always ask your bed partner to film you. So they'd be things you can do. But for example, I actually do a nose breathing test, 3-minute nose breathing test when I'm assessing and evaluating patients. And we do it, we do a few things in that 3 minutes, but just getting people to close their lips, either with tape or holding water in their mouth, or just really making that conscious effort to keep the lips closed. And then I time them for 3 minutes. And the test is, if you can breathe through your nose for 3 minutes, then, that means that you've got a trainable, an adaptive nose that can be trained to breathe better. People who cannot breathe through their nose for 3 minutes usually need to go and see an ENT, ear, nose and throat doctor, to have their nose looked at, because they might have a severely deviated septum, or they might have enlarged turbinates, very large polyps, something that's actually obstructing their nose to the point where they can't train nasal breathing. But many people can train nasal breathing. And actually, are you aware of that? I did a research study on nasal breathing.
Please share. Yeah.
So, we actually, it's in the breathing scene, it's sort of well known that you really should try and encourage people to breathe through their nose, because the nose has about 30 different functions, antibacterial, antiviral, connects with the brain, regulates the breathing system, protects the lungs, on and on. It's associated with better headspace, more calm, clearer, less brain fog and all of that. So you do want to encourage nasal breathing. And so many people in the breathing world actually say, well, just shut your mouth and breathe through your nose, use it or lose it. No one's actually tested how much this is the case and whether breathing rehabilitation protocols work. So we did a little study where we got, about 25 people who had trouble breathing through their nose. We did that 3-minute nasal breathing test. And if they passed it, we did a 4-week breathing rehabilitation protocol with breathing exercises where we trained the functions of the nose, the muscles. We trained the nerves, like the trigeminal nerve, which picks up sensations. People who are mouth breathers sometimes get, they get a kind of a deafferentation or reduced function of some of those nerves in the nose that connect with the brain. And we did, techniques to improve the health of the nasal mucosa using oscillating breathing techniques and humming and things like that. And then we reevaluated them at the end of 4 weeks, and people got a fantastic improvement in their ability to nasal breathe. But they also told us that they were sleeping better, felt calmer, felt more energy, just felt better in ways that they didn't expect. So we thought that was a bit of a win, and we published that paper in a journal. And so my hope, I'm all about people getting appropriate treatment. So if you need to have nasal surgery or you need some intervention, then that's what you need to have. But there are a lot of people who don't respond 100% to ENT treatment, and they can't forever take the medications, or the medications don't really work. So I'm trying to sort of get the word out there that just like other parts of the breathing system, like the pharynx, like the larynx, like the diaphragm, like the rib cage, you can train the function, and hardly anybody does. And it's actually a big gap, in the wellness scene, appropriately evaluate, individualize, and rehabilitate the breathing system.
Yeah, because you often hear about, the exercise, the diet, and the sleep, and they're probably the three main areas. But breathing, up until, I guess, recently, it hasn't really come into my...
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
imagine. Yeah. And this is true. Like, I think it was 30 years ago that I started really getting into breathing.
Wow.
And people would just think you were kind of mad. Like, they'd say, I still work as a regular osteopath. I do manual therapy and I work with all kinds of things and so on, But in those days, as an osteopath, they'd say, oh, what's your sort of special interest, or what do you do? And I go, oh, I'm really into breathing. And they'd say, right, good luck with that.
But you're leading the way. You're at the forefront today, and there's so much interest in it. There's a lot of people out there talking about techniques, and you hear about the mouth taping, and that takes off virally on social media, on TikTok.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, is there anything out there that you think you consider that there's really misleading people around breathing? Is there any statements that you've seen published around breathing, or particular techniques that you think aren't as effective as what they say they are?
Yeah, look, you know what? I think there's a place. Everything that's out there and popular has got a place and works for somebody. Otherwise, it wouldn't be out there and popular, because it's working for some people. But the thing is that one size doesn't fit all. And that would be an important message to get out there. One size does not fit all. You really can't assume that because someone is doing really, really well with big, strong, deep breathing, combined with ice baths, you know what I'm talking about, that's going to work for everybody. And some people, it will really destabilize them. And, it might, it destabilizes brain rhythms. Like, some people get kind of seizures, or it might destabilize cardiac rhythms, or a lot of people are on the edge of having hyperventilation. They don't have good recovery with hyperventilation techniques. And so they don't do well. So some older people with a lot of stress and trauma, or just someone whose breathing is really compromised, might not do as well. But those techniques can be fantastic, and I love them all. And I love that sort of stuff. And also, like, there are other people out there saying that what we've all got to do is reduce our breathing, breathe less. Everyone is hyperventilating. And you know what? A lot of people are stressed and over-breathing. But sometimes they're stressed and over-breathing for a reason, like their airways are too obstructed, or they've got some compromise of their lungs. And in a way, or maybe their airways closing up at night with sleep apnea. And it could be that they're actually hypoventilating, meaning that they're actually under-breathing and their CO2 is too high. And so you actually need to measure to find out what is going on with that person and adjust the therapy to them. But, so that would be the main message, really. I think even some of the more extreme hyperventilation techniques, where they really do it and they do it for hours and on and on and on. People have had amazing breakthroughs and transformations from those things, and that's really great. It's just that it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So I think that, most of these things are not dangerous or bad, because what will happen is that when something isn't working for someone, they just won't continue it most of the time, So in a way, it's self-correcting, But in my world, where I work with people with chronic and complex conditions and illnesses, they've often been through lots of tracks and they've spent a lot of time and energy doing things that haven't really worked for them. And the bottom line is that they've needed someone to accurately assess their breathing and give them a targeted, individualized approach. So that's the thing. And the mouth taping, you want to talk about that for a second?
Absolutely.
When I think of mouth taping.
Yeah.
So mouth taping, again, it's not for everyone. And You don't want to be so obstructed and have your oxygen dropping at night because you've got like a super, bad upper airway and tongue that's dropping in your throat. Mostly breathing through the nose will help to open up the upper airway. But there are some people who are they're too obstructed, and too compromised to do it. And children, of course, will often have enlarged adenoids and tonsils and really shouldn't be taped. So again, most people who don't tolerate the taping where it's not right for them, they just won't do it. They'll wake up in the morning with a headache and feel bad or end up taking it off. So I guess it's not really dangerous. In fact, we did a big survey. This is 20 years ago, of Buteyko practitioners who were recommending mouth taping. When we said, have you had any reports of adverse events? And that was just myself and a doctor from the UK. And he, contacted people, and we didn't actually get any reports of adverse effects. But just in theory, and myself as a health professional who takes their responsibilities very seriously, I don't just say, tape your mouth. I say, let's check you out. Let's tape your mouth and check your oxygen. Let's tape your mouth and see if it's putting you into a sympathetic stress state. Let's actually see what this is like for you, And I never would start taping until someone's been working with their breathing for a while and we've sorted out the major problems.
That's such great advice in terms of it's not a one-size-fits-all. It really requires a tailored approach based on what they need in terms of addressing the underlying issues. What's behind it? Why? And that's essentially the work you do, is get to the why and understand what's obstructing it or what's driving the dysfunctional breathing, and then address the concern, and then start correcting breathing patterns and getting the conductor back leading the orchestra, as you said. Absolutely.
And I guess the other thing too is like, breathing doesn't cure everything. You got it. It's always appropriate. So it's a matter of, appropriately taking care of things like underlying pathologies and, getting appropriate help with a psychologist or whatever at the same time. It's an adjunctive therapy, often breathing.
Yeah, fantastic. And as you said, it needs to be taken into context, and you're very much that holistic practitioner, and obviously making sure you're working on what's most important for that patient and what's going to get them the best results. So, there was very pragmatic
approach I've got these days. Very pragmatic. It's like, what's going to reduce suffering the most, the fastest,
Well, after all those years' experience, I can imagine you can get to it very quickly with your clients. You'd be able to,
I try.
I really can. I know you recommend that it's not a one size fits all, but is there some general tips that you can share with the listeners that could really help optimize or improve their breathing?
Yeah, happy to. Thinking about breathing, we've got two sort of ways of breathing. This is from the work of an anatomist called Anton de Troyer, who was really looking at the muscles of breathing. And he came up with two terms. He said there's the active configuration of breathing and there's the relaxed configuration. So when you're about to jump or run or do something active, or there's a need for a lot of air, you will breathe high and you'll make your breathing faster. And you put more emphasis on the inhale. And many people are too much in the active configuration of breathing. So most of us can do with taking some time to just sit, relax our shoulders, drop them down, focus on the body, and just gently slow and lower the breath. That's pretty safe advice for everyone. And it's never just about the breath. It's about how you pay attention to it. So pay attention to it without trying too hard to make it perfect, but just you're settling into your body. You're settling into your breath, and you're just gently encouraging your breath to be expressive of a relaxed state of a relaxed configuration, respecting that your breath may be the way it is for whatever reason, but you're just taking it towards that relaxed configuration so that you're getting more of the, stillness and calm that we all crave and need, because you need your switch on, switch off thing to be going on for your body to function well. You got to go when you go, and you really want to stop and rest and you got to do that. So you can use the breathing to help that happen. And you just do that frequently throughout the day, and that would be fundamental advice that would pretty much work for anybody.
Oh, fantastic tips. I've really appreciated the conversation and all the wisdom you've shared with the listeners on functional breathing. It's such a, as you said, it's a very popular topic at the moment, and I'm so glad that you were able to share, I guess, the evidence base behind functional breathing and help lead the listeners on a course that's probably more appropriate. And certainly it leads me to the next question is, how can the listeners best connect with you?
Oh, well, my contact details are all on my website, which is my name, which is just Rosalba, like Rosalba, Courtney, Courtney, Courtney.com. So my contact details are there on my website, and info about what I've got happening there in terms of practitioner training or patient, consultations or workshops or online training. So that would be the way.
Fantastic.
And I work in Sydney at the Gen Biome Clinic in Edgecliff, and also at my own clinic in Avalon on the Northern Beaches. And
can you share, I know you're building an online course, which I think you've completed. Is it right? Or?
Yep. So I've got a course starting in October, the 17th of October, but that course is actually full now. But I'll be doing ongoing courses. And the thing with that course is, because I'm, dedicated to this idea of individualized breathing therapy, people have to have an assessment with me first, where I can evaluate, their CO2, their oxygen at rest and under challenge. And we do breath holding times and breathing pattern tests and so on and so on. Check their lungs. And then if it's suitable for them to do the course, then, we're just doing small groups. Because over the time of COVID, I just learned, hey, this is a really great way to do it. People don't have to travel, and, I could do it people from all over.
Well, there's US listeners, listeners from Europe, and I'm thinking that they're thinking, well, how can you help me? And so
I see people from the US and the UK and Europe all the time these days.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. It's great. We're so interconnected with technology these days. It's really wonderful.
Sure are.
Yeah. And to the listeners, I'll include the link to the website in the show notes. So you can just go directly to the show notes, click on the link, and everything will be there for you on the website. And I'd like to thank you once again, Dr. Rosalba Courtney. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom. It's been wonderful. I've learnt a lot, and I'm sure the listeners have.
Thank you, Anthony, for your great questions and your interest.
You're welcome.
Spread the word.
You're very welcome. And to the listeners, thank you for tuning in to another insightful episode of Me and My Health Up. And please share it with others that you could think that would benefit from better functional breathing, or if you know that they snore, or that if it's someone that you've heard that's a snorer or has a reputation for not breathing quite normally. What's normal, I guess. But
sorry, I've confused you. But you're right.
Then please share it with them. We'd love to get the word out there and get the great work of Dr. Rosalba Courtney out to the world. So thank you.